dramatic changes that are going to affect us all. And again, I'm going to give you one or two just introductory statistics just to set the scene by what I mean by these dramatic changes taking place. And whilst you are sitting here with me for the next 45 minutes or an hour or so, just during this presentation, about 15,000 babies are going to be born in the world. That's about how many young babies are born in a 24-hour period on the planet, 15,000. About 500 of those get born in the United States, approximately, while you are sitting here with me. In China, about 1,800 babies are born whilst you are sitting here with me. And in one of my favorite countries on this planet, in India, over 3,000 babies are going to be born just while you are sitting here with me. Now, put that into your hat and smoke it, as the old saying goes, because I could just sit down and I could just let you think about the implications for this tremendous population explosion that is happening right now and happening in these newly developing regions of the world with potentially profound implications, some of which I won't deal with now. I will deal in the lecture when I talk more about aspects of India and China. But what's so important about this era that we are in right now? According to demographers, and I've done a fair amount of research on this for my book, according to demographers, the next 40 to 50 years will see the fastest increase in human population ever on this planet. In other words, we are going to go from 7 billion people on the planet right now to about 9 billion people by 2050. That's 2 billion onto the existing 7 billion right now. That's a pretty fast population increase. And may I just say that after 2050, demographers are not sure about whether this increase in population is going to continue in quite a dramatic fashion or whether it's perhaps going to taper off. And there is some good news because many theorists now suggest that this level of population growth will not necessarily be sustained. But I can tell you it's a future prediction, and the United Nations, who do most of the detailed work on the demographic future of the planet, are as unsure about this as they have ever been, and they've issued reports only in the last month or two which have contradicted their reports for the last 2 years. It just shows you how they're not sure about where the population of the world is going to go. Suffice to say, a very fast and growing global population. And let me just quickly, because I'm interested in population growth, show you where populations are growing. And perhaps, you don't have to be a genius to figure out where the growth populations are, but look at the comparison of this map. This is the population growth of the world, or the world represented in terms of where people are living in 1960. So if we were around in 1960, you can see how bloated Europe is. Here, Europe is pretty fat, indicating the European population was relatively large in proportion to the entire global population in 1960. You can see, obviously, China, India, Japan for that matter, pretty fat and pretty bloated in terms of having large populations. You can note here in 1960 that Africa was fairly lean and scrawny for that matter. Its population not dramatically large by any comparisons to the other markets, the US and of course Latin America, relatively stable. Now, I want to flash forward from 1960. So have a look at the map, and I'll just flash forward to 2050. Well within, I would hope, the lifetime of most of us here, and I think with medical advancements, as I'll mention later, we might all see 2050. Not quite sure whether everybody wants to see 2050, but we will all see 2050. Now, watch in particular what happens to global populations in Europe and in Africa by 2050. Let me go back to 1960. Watch Europe. That's Europe. That's 1960. And here we go to 2050. And what's noteworthy about this is the dramatic population declines of Europe, Western Europe, and for that matter, Eastern Europe as well. Western Europe dramatically so, and the dramatic increase in population levels in particularly West Africa and East Africa. India remains, of course, a huge source of population and will overtake China in terms of total population probably in about 30 to 40 years' time, China will reduce slightly, partially because of the one-child policy in China and an aging population. For those of you who happen to be Russian in the audience, need I remind you that the Russian population is going to shrink pretty dramatically. By 2050 to about 100 million people, profound implications for Russia, and for my friends in Australia, that's what Australia looks like by 2050, but South Africans always have this kind of competitive edge with Australians, so one wants to show these things. What's interesting about Africa, West Africa increases in population, so does East Africa. South Africa does not. It remains fairly scrawny because of the effects of HIV/AIDS on the Southern African community. For the United States, again, relatively constant, and the one thing about looking at demographics into the future, Europe is in trouble because it's losing younger people. Birth rates are down. The United States as a country, in terms of its future demographics, is fairly healthy. It's the only one of the Western nations of this world to have a fairly positive birth rate, and that will be positive for the US going forward. There will be younger people, and those younger people will be able to do the work. And ultimately, the world needs younger people to do the work. And that's why the controversy exists in Europe as to where will the young people come from? Who will do the work in Europe once those societies have become somewhat more aged? And that's part of this debate about whether Turkey should be included in the EU, because Turkey's got young people, and the young people will help do the work in Western Europe. So there's a tremendous debate going forward about it. The US is well positioned as a Western nation in the world, but look to see where future growth and where future contraction is going to come from as well. Africa is going to be a population powerhouse. By 2050, a quarter of the world's population will be African, or will live on the African continent. That's how populous Africa is going to be, and already in the next 20 years, the population of Africa is going to be larger than that of China or India. So Africa is where they're going to be young people, and of course we will discuss it